I say this as a fashion historian. Fashion doesn't matter. At least not like it used to. Now, obviously, I am not talking about clothing. We need to wear clothing for warmth and health reasons, but fashion, as in the trends and the industry and the style, is a completely different matter. Supposedly, throughout history, it's down to two major reasons why we have it. That is either a show of wealth and status, or it's a way to fit in, to wear the same things, the same styles as the people in your community, thus marking people as a participating member. But neither of these things really seems to apply in our modern world. Most of society has lost the knowledge in how to read clothing when it comes to cost. And we don't really broadcast it nearly as loudly as we used to. So the difference between an outfit that costs $200, $2,000, or $20,000 is much more subtle than it used to be, and very difficult for most people to be able to tell the difference. Even the urge to conform or stand out, it doesn't hold the same weight to dress in a way that is part of mainstream culture versus counterculture. There's just too much variety, and many will claim that honestly fashion is just too casual for either of those things to matter anymore. Everyone just wears jeans and t-shirts. We can't tell the difference between people wearing them in terms of their beliefs or their income or anything. So what reasons do we still have for fashion today? Does this actually herald the oncoming death of the industry? Are we doomed to a future of unisex jumpsuits? Okay, well, that last part might be taking it a little bit too far. But to understand where we actually are, we need to understand how we got here. And rather than cover absolutely everything through all of history, I'm going to ground us in a few very specific time periods that I think are great examples of how that need for fashion has changed throughout the centuries. I'm actually going to be making a coat in a surprisingly universal style. We often call it a trapeze cut today, but it goes by so many different names. Simply a coat that has a very voluminous shape to it, though it's fitted up at the shoulders. And looking at how this sort of coat was made and worn throughout history will help jump us through different major eras to see how fashion was important in each one. Because it's not just important how clothing was worn, it's also important how it was made, how it was acquired. The making of goods is a large part of their story. So let's head back to the early 17th century. Garments of this shape, with and without sleeves, certainly existed across broad spectrums of class. But there is going to be a stark difference between those made out of silk and velvet, which pooled and trained upon the ground, and those made out of a rough wool for the function of keeping warm or protected. In this time period, clothing is custom made, regardless of who you are. Yes, there is some secondhand clothing market. I talked about the entire history of that at length in one of my recent videos, but it's important to call back to that in knowing that secondhand in this era was for those that were absolutely desperate, and even the clothing that they were purchasing was custom made for someone else first. The vast majority of people had their clothing made that way. And that's in large part because the fabric is the major expense. So tailors are not going to make up an entire garment out of a fabric that was very expensive, even if it was on the cheaper side, and hope that the right person comes along who fits into it, who likes all of the choices they made in fabric and design, rather than just buy the fabric and wait for that person to show up, tell them exactly what they want. So as an average or wealthy person in the early 17th century, they'd be walking into a tailor shop or into large merchant shops in order to purchase fabric that was imported from all over the world, made by likely dozens of hands, which took hundreds if not thousands of hours to grow and spin, weave and dye and finish. And they would choose what they could afford, what they wanted in cost, and they would take that to their tailor and tell them exactly what they wanted made up, which is a very fascinating thing in the fact that they could theoretically have whatever they wanted. Now, obviously, if you come in with a completely crazy idea, you might need to spend some time finding a tailor who's open to trying dramatically new things, but we don't really see that. generally people are wearing the same style of clothing, the same sort of cut of clothing, and that's because so much of the value of these things is in their fabric. That is what is going to broadcast to everyone around them what class they are in, how much money they make, how much they can afford, because frankly, they're all shopping at pretty much the same places for fabric. They're going to see how much money some of those things cost, so they'll have a pretty good idea of what is expensive and what is cheap, and how much so. And this style of coat, with its grand expanse of fabric, would, yes, keep you warm in a practical sense, but would also be a great display if you could afford a lot of very expensive goods. So you could have yard after yard of large pattern brocaded silks that would really show off, and the shape doesn't require a lot of cutting, a lot of piecing. You're able to really put all of the fabric that you purchased in there. It's a great investment piece as well, because it can just be remade into another thing later. When that style goes out, the fabric is still perfectly good for another outfit years down the road, or for another family member. So it is an investment to be purchasing that fabric, and it's a very small amount of money to have it made up in whatever style you want to make sure that it fits you and looks good. Fashion is able to keep moving at a very good pace, just with remaking and reusing the really expensive parts. So if it's not the cut of your clothing that really broadcasts who you are in society, there's not the same need to conform or rebel with that. Wearing strange clothing in different cuts doesn't really say much about who you are or aren't. Wearing certain textiles is what's broadcasting who you are and how others should be treating you. Skipping forward through the Enlightenment of the 18th century, where honestly not much changed with the making of clothing, but we are starting to see a rumble of change in society by the end of that century, with things like the American and the French Revolution. There are major social movements taking place that are starting to close the distance between the upper and lower classes, where suddenly we no longer have the aristocracy and their seemingly endless supply of either cash or at least credit in order to acquire these grand, amazing things. Instead, we've brought our class structure just a little bit closer together. And add in that machinery was making fabric so much cheaper than it ever was before. Instead of everything having to be done by hand and taking thousands of hours, suddenly machines can be added into the process and speed everything up. That means that fabric of middling or even really good quality can be purchased for much cheaper, much more accessible to the average person. This is the point where the middle class starts appearing throughout America and Europe with enough money to start consuming a fair bit of nice goods. But with that, there's a reason why so much of 19th century fashion is full of yard after yard of trim and fabric. Even men's suits are layer upon layer. So there is a lot of yardage that goes into these clothing items, cut and pieced up in new ways that isn't really reusable in the way it used to be. Suddenly clothing is a lot more short-lived in terms of fashion. Most gowns and suits were still being custom made, but there is an increase, slowly but surely, in the amount of ready-made clothing. So something like a paletote, that shape of coat that we're looking at, would have been the type of thing early on, even in the 1860s, that women could have gone into stores and purchased ready-made. Now, they still had options with this usually. Plenty of menswear was also starting to be ready-made, even men's suits, though they often came with an understanding that there would be some level of customization and adjustment, hems and the like. But ready-made clothing was starting to be an option, so you could walk into small local shops or even just the beginnings of a few large department stores in very big cities. Suddenly the world of shopping was changing and our relationship with clothing along with it. While there still is a broad range of cheap, middling, and very expensive clothing options and fabric out there, it is getting less and less obvious in the fact that it is becoming more and more accessible. The middle class is growing and they are purchasing more than ever before. And so defining your status through your clothing is not just for the very wealthy anymore. This will only continue that direction as we make our way into the 20th century. America in particular is mass producing on an extensive scale, and it's not meant for just one person or one class either. By the 19-teens, we see the return of our coat style again, though it's just a flash in the pan moment from about 1915 through 1919 that it exists. For the average woman looking to purchase something like this, she would likely first see it in women's and fashion magazines and advertisements, listing exactly who designed the style underneath, often some fancy French name from far away, and she would then go into her local department store to purchase something very similar. They might even have nearly exact copies of that designer's work. Though a lot of fashion is coming from French couture houses in terms of the designs, they aren't the ones shipping ready-made clothing over to the US to be sold. That is not at all their system. In fact, when they did shows of their new styles, they wouldn't even allow people to bring in anything other than a small sheet of paper and a pencil to write down words. You couldn't do drawings or anything like that. So instead, there arose this whole industry of people managing to sketch things down right after seeing them, send them over back to the US with all of the details, have things made up and mass-produced and copied within only a few days. So these couture styles from Paris made their way into US department stores for the average woman or even the wealthy woman to walk in and purchase them. They would go into these different departments for different specialty items, have assistants shopping through all of the different options, making sure that things were adjusted to fit them as needed, and be able to often take things home that day. And this is a very American concept that does start to spread. In France around the same time, instead of everyone going to large department stores or even small local stores and buying ready-made, there's still a big difference between the average person buying some ready-made, some cheaper custom things, and the very wealthy who are getting things entirely custom, uniquely made by the French couture houses. If you want to read more about that, I highly recommend the book Fashion is Spionage, which is a book that was written by Elizabeth Hawes and published in 1940 about her time working within that industry between France and America, the 1920s and 30s. Absolutely fascinating look on fashion, which is surprisingly still applicable in modern day, and part of what inspired me to talk about this topic. But she extensively talks about how in America, everyone is purchasing these ready-made expensive brands or copies of expensive brands. They're just readily available to everyone in a huge range of prices. Since fabric is no longer a major expense, having clothing that is up to date and fashionable, and having a wide range of clothing styles which work in a range of different social situations that are arising in the 20th century is what says a lot more about your class and your income than the fabric it's made out of. We aren't remaking clothing in the way that we did before. The styles are requiring far too many small cuts. The fabric isn't holding up like it used to. Instead of investing in large quantities of fabric to be reused over and over again, changing out undergarments on the regular in order to stay clean, we instead are investing most of that clothing in our outerwear being replaced year after year, which I talked about at length in the previous video looking at how much clothing they actually had. But it's this sudden explosion of consumerism, of buying more and more fashionable goods, things that you didn't need only a few years prior, but now are in every household and in every closet, that really defines the 1920s. It is not just a capitalistic view of you need to just keep buying things because they'll make you happier. It's also a mindset of it's supporting the country. In post-World War I era US or even in Europe, you're supporting your national or even global economy by purchasing things in order to make sure that our industries are moving forward, in order to make sure that as a good society, we are supporting that way of life. Americans aren't out there buying a great deal of clothing in order to imitate royalty or even the rich. They are trying to participate in the American life, in some ways competing with their friends and neighbors for who can manage to have the best stuff and be the best American. Now, I know that's a concept that we really associate with the 1950s, and that is where we are headed next. This brings us to that 1950s swing coat. when the style shows up again. We've only doubled down on all of those concepts since the 1920s, and expectations of what someone's closet should be able to achieve are very high. A different outfit for every different situation, time of day, type of social engagement. You really need a lot of clothing in order to participate even in just middle-class society. It is, in many ways, the era of consumerism. And all of that translates to being a good participant in society, something that is considered incredibly important after yet another world war. By this point, shopping at department stores is very much a way of life for everyone. Going to purchase clothing, you would walk in and see section after section of different types of clothing, different styles, rack after rack of clothing pre-made in different sizes out for you to handle yourself. So no longer is someone walking in and expecting help from behind the counter to pull out good after good to look through. Instead, they walk in and are left to their own devices to figure out what on these hundreds of racks is going to be within their budget, what they need is in style or maybe already going out of style, is going to flatter them, or whatever else. So knowing how to navigate that, knowing what to buy, or being wealthy enough to go to the department stores that will still assist you in making sure that you are buying the best things, how to find clothing that looks good but is also within your budget, is the bigger tell of class at this point in time. There are literal courses out there to teach women how to do that sort of shopping, how to dress, and how to stay in fashion without breaking the budget. Because in the end, it's just as impressive to have a moderate income but be very skilled at spending it as it is to have a bigger income and be far less skilled. But it says a lot about the household to be managing itself properly. So having new clothing or up-to-date styles, skill in dressing, and always looking put together says a lot. The time that it takes to accomplish fashion is highly valued. In doing your hair, your makeup, putting on an entire well-pressed suit and tie, making sure that everything is brushed down and clean says so much. And for that reason, this is the time where counterculture in terms of fashion really starts up. Alternative groups start deciding they don't want to participate in that sort of consumer culture, in putting in that amount of time and effort and money only to be judged on their worth in society based on those things. It is a constant battle to not lose status, and it's not one that everyone wants to fight. So there are plenty of people who are resistant to that idea and like to show it through their clothing, because participating in that ideal is very much shown through your clothing. Skipping forward to the 21st century, to today, where honestly this style of coat is coming in again. We certainly have leaned into fast fashion and the cheap clothing market harder than we ever have before. It's not to say that it didn't exist before, we're just really good at it. But it's not this which has directly destroyed fashion. If anything, it's a symptom of the fact that we have so much abundantly available to us, a variety of styles and options and price points that we can constantly choose from. Because the 20th century goal was making clothing more accessible and easier to care for, in terms of making sure that that presentation, if being well put together, is much easier and takes less time to accomplish, the quality became less important. It was more important that something didn't wrinkle or stain as easily, was able to be thrown into the washing machine to refresh it, than it was to have it made out of a very fine silk or wool, which would be more difficult to care for, but more expensive. So it's not the cost of the fabric that's really the important part here, it's the upkeep and the look of it. We truly lost our ability to know what is expensive and what is cheap. There is such a subtle difference in terms of the look of cheap versus expensive clothing, but the long-term wear and care can make a really big difference. All this means that we can't judge someone's status by the cost of their clothing in most cases. Even something like branding, which is supposed to declare the cost of your clothing, is something practiced by the middle class or the newly wealthy, rather than those who have always had money and don't feel the need to proclaim it in that way. The wide variety of options available to us is also canceling out the participation in society aspect. We don't all dress alike, despite the fact that, yes, the joke of everyone wears jeans and t-shirts is out there. We don't have one main type of style that everyone is adhering to, and specific tiny countercultures that are choosing to not participate and wear alternative clothing. The idea of a middle-class uniform that used to be so clear is just not really easy to establish anymore. Yes, there are still some elements of how to dress like you are middle class, including things like modesty, making sure that your clothing is clean and not worn burned down. Things are often simple and clean. And there are still plenty of people that try to enforce those standards on others. This is something that we know that the middle class has a tendency to do. That sort of dressing and control over it is also a very weird form of safety for some people. So those that feel like they follow the status quo, they want to be able to pinpoint others who also do. We follow the same rules, we follow the same etiquette. Our experience, even if we don't know each other, will be very predictable and sensible. However, this only works for a very limited portion of society. Say we go back to that 1950s point and look at how people were dressing to proclaim that. That only really works if you are part of the approved middle class. So having someone wear that clothing doesn't proclaim the same safety and following of the rules because those rules don't apply in the same way. So signaling I am middle class, therefore trustable by our clothing, doesn't work anymore either. We've now realized that just because someone is dressed nicely doesn't mean that they are going to act nicely. Doesn't mean that they are going to follow the rules and follow status quo, because their set of rules might be only for the people that they respect and not for others. We've long had uneven standards for that, and dressing to say I follow standards, we now know doesn't really say that. But not everyone's quite figured that out yet. However, with the wide variety of clothing options that are out there and the styles that are out there, counterculture also isn't speaking in the same way that it used to. It's much more just personal expression, whether it's coming from a couture house and that house's sense of what style is, or from the individual who's purchasing clothing from dozens of different stores to create their own personal look. It is putting emphasis on creativity and enjoyment and comfort. Not just in the physical comfort, but being comfortable about what you wear as well, and sharing that with others. Can say a lot about us as an individual, and it can simply be a sharing of joy. We see the same excitement over comfy outfits that we do over the most fashionable ones. While fashion is not what it used to be. We aren't looking to express our class status. We aren't looking to express how much money we make. And for the vast majority of people, there is inevitably still a small group that does that to some extent, because that is what is important to their part of society. And we also aren't looking to establish our involvement with society on a universal scale, saying I dress like everyone else, so you know that I will act like everyone else, so you know that I participate, so you know that I am a good consumer. Instead, we are saying I am participating in society by sharing a little bit of my joy with others. Something that I am hoping to do a lot of over the next few weeks as I sort of take this show on the road on a pretty long trip that I'm taking on the East Coast, where I'm going to be putting my historic traveling wardrobe to the test in the next video. So make sure to subscribe and sign up for notifications so you don't miss out on that.